back. Most of you are saying Assalamu alaikum to the professor on the chat. So we are conveying these salamat to the professor. And again, we spoke about the professor before. We didn't know that he's here, but now that we know, we should say that, again, that he's one of the prominent professors of Sharia. He is the head of many fiqh majalis in, I think, in Canada, and he has been a professor in many universities. He wrote many books, and he has many lectures on the web, some of which you've heard and you've studied. And today he will be with us to speak about what is fiqh and how can we approach it. And please, if you have, we will have a Q&A session after we finish. Please, if you want to write the question on chat, I will be taking it, asking you to the professor. If you want to speak, raise your hand after the professor finishes, and we will be giving you the chance accordingly. And again, we say welcome to Professor Jasser Aude, and the mic is yours.
MashaAllah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillah hamdan kathiran tayyiban mubarakan fih, mubarakan alayhi, kama yuhibbu rabbuna warda. وكما ينبغي لجلال وجهه وعظيم سلطانه. الصلاة والسلام على أسعد خلقه وخاتم رسله محمد صلى الله عليه وآله. ورضي الله عن المهاجرين والأنصار ومن تبعهم بإحسان إلى يوم الدين. ثم أما بعد. After praising Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and sending peace upon his Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, it is such a pleasure to be back. Thank you, Brother Yusuf, for this introduction, and my salamat and tahiyyat and ihtiramat to everybody in the great and very distinct Tafakkur Center, which I was just telling Brother Yusuf, I'm looking forward to visit very soon, inshallah, as soon as, inshallah, the pandemic allows safe traveling, inshallah. A very interesting topic. I was very happy to receive that invitation because I thought that I would like to make some fundamental points with our students in this course, whom I all welcome and warmly welcome to this session. What is fiqh? And what is more important than what is fiqh is how do we judge fiqh? How do we define fiqh? Or rather, how do we define anything? And then from defining anything, we go to defining fiqh. And from defining fiqh, we go to how to apply fiqh. And the relationship between fiqh and modernity, which you are focusing on, the impact of modernity on Islamic thought, which is the topic of what I'm saying. But I would like to start from a more fundamental point, which is exactly as some people are saying in the chat, al-hukmu ala shay'i far'un an tasawwurihi. You judge something based on how you perceive it, how you cognize it. At-tasawwur is a worldview, is a way of conceptualization and cognition. And how we do that? The question of how is a question of a source of knowledge. What is the source of knowledge in Islam? Oftentimes I have students, graduate students, sometimes professors, conducting research in Islamic studies, and they refer to quote unquote primary sources. And their primary sources are usually people from the past. So a primary source is a manuscript of one of the Imams of Islam, and that is the primary source of how they will conduct an Islamic research. And I always object to that. I say the primary source to start with is the revelation, al-wahy, the Quran and Sunnah. What Imam al-Shafi'i and Abu Hanifa and Malik, what Ibn Taymiyyah and al-Qaradawi and Abdul Karim Zidan, and even what Umar ibn al-Khattab and Aisha and Ibn Abbas radiallahu anhum jami'an, all of them are secondary sources, not primary. The primary source in Islam is the Quran and the Sunnah of Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. Then what is fiqh? Let us go to the Quran and see what is fiqh, because this will anchor us through history and through geography that might have distorted or changed or altered the original definitions of fiqh, sharia, ilm, hukm, Islah, Ifsad, Taghut, Adl, and so forth. The whole framework, the whole worldview of Islam, in the Islamic cultures, sometimes they take interpretations that are right and sometimes interpretations that are wrong. And sometimes interpretations that are wide and comprehensive and holistic, and sometimes interpretations that are narrow and biased and partialistic. Fiqh, in the original sense, ليتفقهوا في الدين, the fiqh in that sense, نبين الآيات لقوم يفقهون. فقه فقه يفقه is to have a deep understanding. This is the original linguistic, if you wish, definition of fiqh. A deep understanding in what? The Quran is saying in the ayat. The ayat are not the verses in English. Verse is a very biblical word. Ayat are signs, are proofs. The Quran is composed of ayat or proofs. It's not composed of verses, unless we speak in English in an approximation. The ayat or the verses are not just the ayat in the kitab. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, سَنُرِيهِمْ آيَاتِنَا فِي الْآفَاقِ وَفِي أَنفُسِهِمْ حَتَّى يَتَبَيَّنَ لَهُمْ أَنَّهُ الْحَقِّ. We will show them our signs, our proofs in the horizons and in themselves, so that they know that it is the truth. And therefore, fiqh deals with the ayat and with the deen. I'll speak about the deen now in a comprehensive sense. The ayat are both the ayat that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sent in the revelation in the book and explained by Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam in his sunnah, and the ayat that the book is referring us to look at in the horizons and in the souls and the societies and the people. The book is teaching us how to read history. History is not a separate science. This aqli and naqli is really inaccurate, because a naqli is at the basis of Islam, and we go from a naqli to everything that is aqli. A naqli is not the Islamic history of fiqh. See, there is a difference between fiqh and the history of fiqh. And what we often study in a college of Sharia is actually the history of fiqh, which is very important, but it's not fiqh. Fiqh today is how to apply the kitab and sunnah on the reality. And this is not a Salafi school. I mean, Salafi schools is one of the schools. It is to study the Salafi schools and the Shafi'i and the Maliki, and for that matter, the Ja'fari and the Zaydi, and for that matter, the Asha'ira and the Mu'tazila and the Ibadiyya and the Zaydi, to study our history, yes, but to deal in fiqh, in understanding with the reality, not with the history, and not to copy from the books of history. Obviously, I'm not talking about ash-sha'air or the rituals. I'm not talking about how to make wudu and pray. And this is not changeable. This is a fixed constant. I'm not talking about how to define Allah forbid zina or qatl or riba, or this is fixed. We're not going to change the definition of zina and alter the definition of family, therefore, or change the definition of riba and alter what is halal and what is haram in the mu'amalat. I'm not talking about that. These are fixed and constant and sacred parts of Islam. But I'm talking about the majority of what we see in life, in knowledge. What is fiqh? Fiqh is about everything. Fiqh is leadership. The Prophet ﷺ said, Al-Fuqaha'u Qada. Hadith is mursal in one narration and connected in another narration. The hadith is sahih. I can argue that, inshallah, with you on the side in the Q&A. Al-Fuqaha'u Qada means that the fuqaha are the leaders. When Imam Ali radiallahu anhu asked the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam what to do if they don't find something in the book of Allah or in what they know about the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he said, "Istashiru al-fuqaha." Consult the fuqaha. The fuqaha are the people of shura and the people of qiyada, of leadership. And that is not only in the legal matters or the fatwa matters. Fatwa is one side, but it's in everything. The Sahaba radiallahu anhum understood fiqh in the general sense. Fuqaha or Sahaba were the leaders, not just in courts, not just in teaching in the mosque, but also on the battlefield, in agriculture and markets. they were the leaders in everything. Eventually, generations came after to be leaders in science. At the height of the Islamic civilization, fiqh dealt with sciences seamlessly. There was no division between fiqh and sciences. Examples, Imam al-Ghazali, when he dealt with the diameter of the earth and the size, and this was part of fiqh. Al-Kindi, Al-Jahid, when he wrote about al-Hayawan, his book on animals, in the introduction, he's talking about fiqh, actually. Imam Jasser Aude and his students who dealt with mathematics, Jabir ibn Hayyan, and so on, algebra and algorithms, and eventually, of course, Bayt al-Hikmah, the House of Wisdom. This was fiqh, and these people were called fuqaha. The doctors in the hospitals that were part of the awqaf in Islam, in history, they were called fuqaha too. Yes, they were doctors. They were known to be ahlul tib. You know, they have a specialization, but they were people of fiqh, right? So at the heights of the Islamic civilization, fiqh was not separate from life. Fiqh was not just a legal science, and fiqh dealt with astronomy and optics and chemistry, and dealt with life, the sciences of life. And knowledge was not classified, if I may say, in a secular way. Where did the secular definition of fiqh come from? It came from colonization. Before that, on some levels, it came from the development or the change of the Islamic governance system from a khilafah into a kingdom, from the middle of the 1st century. And fiqh eventually became isolated from a siyasa. And we started to have a class that are called fuqaha al-sultan, the fuqaha of the sultan, versus fuqaha al-ummah. So fuqaha were divided. The fuqaha of the ummah, who continued with the ummah in its civilization. The Islamic civilization, though, was not a civilization of the kingdoms. It was a civilization of the ummah, of the people. Some kings were good and some kings were corrupt. And that did not hinder the ummah from going up in the curve of civilization and to develop civilization, because fiqh was all-inclusive, even though it was isolated from a siyasa. So one side of fiqh, which is, if you wish, political science, today we call it, or political theory, or siyasa sharia, was actually isolated. And it was only to, if you read any of the books, you know, to praise the king or the prince and to justify whatever they do, if they are from Quraysh or not from Quraysh, and all of that. The rest of fiqh continued with the Islamic civilization until the time of the colonization. The decline started from the middle of Hijri, 4th century. The middle of the 7th century, the Ummah was invaded from French from the west and the Mughals from the east, and the Ummah started to disintegrate politically, and it was also a time of disintegration in terms of the society. The Ummah started to have schools of thought that are in conflict with each other. Before that, yes, there were schools of thoughts, but Imam al-Shafi'i prayed in Iraq in the Hanafi way. He didn't mind. But eventually the Shafi'iyya and the Ahnaf became political parties. And they fought. They fought in weapons in Baghdad and Khurasan. And you read history about the wars between, not even the Sunnah and Shia, between the Shafi'iyya and the Ahnaf in our history. And you see in the old mosques in Cairo and Baghdad, 4 mihrab, because we didn't pray behind each other. We didn't marry each other. The Shafi'i cannot marry a Hanafiya and so forth, because people started to consider each other's prayers void and consider each other's marriages void. And it became a very weak point in the Islamic history. That is the point when the Muslim countries were colonized. Every Muslim region was colonized, some very short, like the colonization of Istanbul for a few years, and some very long, like the colonization of North Africa and East Asia, and so for hundreds of years of colonization. And the Portuguese and the Spanish and the Russian and the French and the Japanese, whoever had a force, colonized the Islamic world. Colonization did something that impacted fiqh. How? Because they fought against endowments, against awqaf. And the English made sure that the awqaf and the zakah are void. They couldn't nullify them from the beginning. The Russians did the same in the Russian parts of colonization. They couldn't change them. They eventually did. They eventually annulled zakah, except for the Malay case with the British. And now we don't have zakah as part of what the government does. And eventually they basically tried to limit the awqaf. And in the post-colonial era, some of these governments of what's called Muslim countries, they canceled the awqaf altogether, as the case in Tunis and other places. How did this happen? Because the colonizers wanted to secularize the Muslim societies. And therefore, they redefined fiqh to mean a very narrow area that deals with family law and deals with ibadat in the sha'air sense. As-siyam was-zakah, you can seek fatwa. You want to marry or divorce and so on, yeah, fine. On the Imam Abu Hanifa madhab, on the Imam Malik madhab, and we're going to create for you a mahkama shar'iyya that you can call mahkama court of the Sharia. You go to dispute marriage and divorce. But you want to dispute business? No, this is a secular court. You want to talk about economics or politics? That is secular. You want to deal with science? That has nothing to do with religion. Chemistry is no longer part of fiqh. And astronomy is no longer part of fiqh. And therefore, you are going to study chemistry and physics and astronomy and so on, a la the Western academic classification. And then eventually, you are going to study linguistics and history and social sciences and sociology and anthropology and all of these sciences that are full of basic wrong ideas. How do I know wrong and right? From the source of knowledge, from Islam. In Islam, we define the human in a particular way. We are body and soul and spirit, jasad wa nafs wa ruh. And we are created according to a certain fitrah. In economics, they define the human differently. A human is a greedy, all-knowing kind of thing. I refer to the Chicago School, for example, for a very wrong definition of the human. And therefore, you really cannot build an Islamic economics on top of Chicago School philosophy of the human. You can't. Otherwise, you are part of the capitalist system and you don't know it. You go to psychology and Freud defined the human as a sexual being and all of that stuff. And then you really cannot build an Islamic psychology on top of Freud philosophy, because he's wrong from the beginning. We are not like that. We have desires, but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave us commands to control the desires. And we have different levels of existence. We are not slaves of our desires. We are slaves only of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It's a different epistemology, if I'm going to speak in English, and a different way of defining things. Altogether, you define the human in anthropology in a very colonial way. And actually anthropology and archaeology and all of that, the Orientalism in this, now talking about modernity, is a disaster. And therefore fiqh cannot really deal with this. In fact, fiqh had a number of reactions. Fiqh said these sciences are sciences of aql, ulum aqliya, and therefore we take what they say without critique. I'm a member, as my brother mentioned, of a number of fiqhi bodies. And when we have an issue, we bring a mutakhassis, an expert. If the expert has a good Islamic background, then perhaps there will be, from my perspective, a fruitful and correct discussion. But if the expert is a great Muslim, he prays and he fasts and he gives zakah, but he learned his medicine, he learned his psychology, he learned his law in England or in America, with all due respect, he learned according to a philosophy that is not Islamic. So I cannot accept his definition of death, for example, because the American law defines death in a particular way. We define death differently in Islam. I cannot accept his definition of development or tanmiyah in a particular way, because they define tanmiyah in the World Bank in a particular way. And then he tells me that, well, no, this investment is going to do development. And I'm looking at Islamic economics. but I am defining development a la World Bank. I am defining freedom as the Freedom House is telling me. I'm defining human rights according to the UN. And these are not Islamic definitions. Yes, they intersect with Islam. We have a freedom of faith in Islam. من شاء فليؤمن ومن شاء فليكفر. But we define freedom differently. It's not freedom of religion. We define this differently. We have freedom of choice in marriage in Islam, but we define marriage differently. And zawjiyya and halal and haram and zina and nikah, this is Islam. But if we take a different system of values and superimpose it on fiqh, we are going to develop what I call in my writings apologetic fiqh. A fiqh that is tabriri. It does apologize for the reality. It is the same good old bank that it does the same good old riba, but we call it Islamic. It's the same good old slaughterhouse that treats animals and birds and in a horrible way and slaughter them in millions of numbers and so forth, and throw chicks in the garbage and all of that. But we're going to call it Islamic because there is a recorder in the background that says Bismillah, Bismillah, right? And we are going to call this Islamic arts just because it doesn't have music or it doesn't have, women are wearing hijab or something, like, very superficial things, versus Islamic art as in, where is the essence of the art? What is the philosophy of this art? There is no art for art's sake. This is not Islamic, and this is not rational even. Every action has a purpose, and the artist, if their purpose is just to produce arts, then this is a purposeless art, and there is no art that's purposeless. Every action has a philosophy behind it, objectives to reach, and so forth. And these objectives, they have to define fiqh this way. I'm still talking about fiqh, and I'm still insisting that we should renew fiqh for our times in order, to include knowledge so that we don't not just have fiqh for the courts. We have that, alhamdulillah, and it's developing. And we have fiqh for fatwas, as I mentioned, in marriage and divorce, and how to fast and how to do hajj. We have fiqh in that too. And some of the ethics in the medical ethics and some of the ethics in the economy. Yeah, we have fiqh for that. But Islam is not just about ethics. This is a very narrow definition of Islam. Islam is much wider. Islam is, in English, a philosophy. In Arabic, is a tasawwur. Al-hukmu ala shay'i far'un an tasawwurihi. You cannot really judge, and this is a maxim in fiqh. You cannot judge something unless you have this tasawwur. And tasawwur requires ihata. وَلَمْ تُحِيطُوا بِهَا عِلْمًا. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is asking us to have this ihata, to have this comprehensive approach. إن هذا الدين لن ينصره إلا من أحاطه من جميع جوانبه. Hadith Sayyidina Ali radiallahu anhu, and we can talk about the hadith as well on the side. But the hadith of Imam Ali radiallahu anhu, that this religion is not going to be victorious except with people who can do the ihata, the comprehensive approach. If we lock fiqh in the silo of courts, and especially in the silo of fuqaha as a class of priests or clergy or something, according to secular worldviews, anything religion is going to be clergy, is going to be a different department, people wear certain things. If fiqh is only about that, then we as an ummah are not going to be able to contribute. And we are going to be locked in modernity and now post-modernity, and we're going to be followers to others. But if we go back to the original definition of fiqh and fuqaha and ilm and ulama, al-ulama warathat al-anbiya, wa inna al-anbiya lam yurithu dinaran wala dirhaman wa innama warathu al-ilm. This is the inheritance of the prophets. The inheritance of the prophets is not gold and silver, it is knowledge. And the knowledge of the prophets is comprehensive. Hadith Abu Dharr, for example, when he said that the Prophet ﷺ taught them about everything, including birds. وَمَا مِنْ طَيْرٍ يَطِيرُ فِي السَّمَاءِ إِلَّا حَكَى لَنَا مِنْهُ عِلْمًا. The Prophet ﷺ was not just a theologian. This is now the secular worldview, the secular fiqh. The Prophet ﷺ talked about birds as much as he talked about the markets and the war and peace and everything. But he didn't he didn't talk about perhaps the technical side of things. I mean, it's not his view to teach how to plant a seed. This is up to us. That's why he told them about the hadith when they planted the tree in a particular way and they took his opinion. His opinion, والسلام, had an error there. It's not a moral error, obviously. Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam is ma'soom, is corrected from moral errors. But he would make judgments in issues of technicalities, if you wish, if you speak in English. Al-ala, al-alat. Even though today, al-ala is not void of value. There is no software or hardware that is void of value. What we are using now, the social media, is a monster that has positive impacts and negative impacts. And we have to study the social media and not take it for granted. These American companies mostly, and now Chinese companies, that are making us communicate and defining how we communicate. This is very interesting, and this requires fiqh in order to understand. There is no design without fiqh. No engineer who designs a car or a building or a city or a factory does that without values, without tasawwur. Maybe the engineer doesn't know. The engineer is just a math guy who does very good math and he knows how to build the bridge. But there is no bridge between 2 points without a philosophy behind the bridge and without a methodology behind the design of the cities. You look at the cities in the Islamic civilization. Again, there is a difference between the Islamic civilization and Islam, but Islamic civilization is one manifestation of Islam. Look at the cities, how they were designed, and how the hospitals and the rest of the awqaf, the mosques and the schools, how they were designed and where were they placed and where were the gardens and the water and the wealth to start with. Who controls the wealth? Where is most of the wealth? 60–70% of the wealth in the Islamic civilization. It was in the awqaf. And the awqaf take care of education and take care of health. Health was not a business. Everybody now is trying to make money from the pandemic. And by the end of the pandemic, we will have had a major transfer of wealth from the poor to the rich. This is one side of the analysis of what's happening. I'm not saying it's a conspiracy. It is a pandemic. There is a medical problem. But the economic problem is bigger than the medical problem, in my view, because the amount of people who are going to get sick and get poor and so forth because of the pandemic are much bigger than the amount of people who are going to die from the pandemic. And both is injustice and both is murder, in my perspective. But we have to really understand the situation in a comprehensive way. So when we talk about fiqh today, the fiqh of the pandemic is not just, whether the vaccine has khinzir or whatever or not, or what. This is not the fiqh of the pandemic. The fiqh of the pandemic, what happened in the economies? Why are people hungry? I live in Canada, where there is a very strong social system, but people are hungry in Canada. And south of the border, here not far from me, is the United States. And the United States there are statistics now, about 50% of the Americans experienced hunger in the past year, of the Americans who stole the fortunes of the world. Now, 50% of them are hungry. How does it happen? It's because the pandemic is causing an economic problem as much as it's causing a medical problem. And if fiqh does not comprehend the economic side of the pandemic, we really cannot deal with the pandemic. The political side of the pandemic, everybody who occupied anybody, including in Palestine, is expanding their occupation because of the pandemic. Everybody is taking land, everybody is putting people in prison. It's a circus these days politically, because everybody is using the pandemic for their political ends. And that fiqh has to know that. Fiqh cannot be naive when it comes to the politics and the economics of the time. So in this very quick introduction, I hope I touched on the definition of fiqh and the source of knowledge of fiqh, which is from the revelation, the wahy, and how fiqh applies today, and the impact of modernity and colonization, especially on awqaf, and how the awqaf system when it changed into the current economic system, where the wealth is between governments and business people, the Ummah got lost in between. Because when the Ummah depended on the awqaf, it had a very different civilization. Even if the political system is corrupt, and even if the business was corrupt, but at that point in the Islamic civilization, the awqaf were the spine of that civilization, and good governance and good khalifas during our history knew that and dedicated the awqaf and respected the awqaf. This is a very central point in our fiqh, actually, because when the fuqaha were paid by the awqaf, fiqh was different. When the Islamic universities were supported by the awqaf, they were different and they were saying different things, and scholars were free to object and to resist and so forth, and to do the role in the nasiha and in the teaching, ta'lim of Islam. So I hope that this very quick introduction opens some door for Q&A. And again, I'm so happy to be back, albeit online. Inshallah, looking forward to seeing those of you in Ankara, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
Well, thank you very much, Professor. That was a really great 30 minutes. And again, if you are coming new, if you have any questions, write them on chat or raise your hand, and we will be. I will be giving I will be giving you the mic accordingly. But I would like to start the questions, Professor, if I may.
Inshallah, you will manage the questions, inshallah. Because
I'll be if it's on chat, I will be reading them if they want to.
So I cannot open the screen with the chat. With you manage it, inshallah.
No, I'll be managing it, no problem. Now, my question is, I need to take advantage of you here. Now, the problem is that we're not, like the sum of it, we are not controlling the input of Islamic civilization now. The input of Islamic civilization is being put by other people. Let's say even people from the inside, they don't really care about Islamic identity, Islamic culture, these things. So how could we achieve this ijtihad, this free ijtihad, let's say, free of these kinds of oppressions? How can we achieve, like practically, how can we achieve something like that? Like we had the experience, or we have like majami', and these majami' now, with the problem with, like, some majami' went with some countries, other majami' went with other countries. So how can we now achieve this kind of free ijtihad with the circumstances in which we live?
To achieve, Jazakallah khair, it's a very important question. To achieve this ijtihad, and as you mentioned, to have practical outcomes on the ground, we have to start with research, because the industry of ideas is a very under-supported and under-nourished industry in the Islamic world. The Islamic civilization that you mentioned is the civilization of the Ummah, of the people. And people need ideas. And they need the ideas to transform into educational programs. So number one, research, and number two, education. And then number three, action. If we do action and form parties and whatever, and go out in the street without knowledge, we are not going to be able to change the system, really. We're going to be played by the system. But if we take a seat back and do research, think tanks, we don't have a think tank to study Western civilization anywhere. And we don't have one think tank. And every local university in the West has a Department of Islamic Studies. Department of Islamic Studies doesn't study Islam. It studies Muslims. It studies everything about us and what we do, and every president and every movement and every organ and every language and every media. They study us. Why? Because they want to understand whom they invade and whom they be friends with, even if we give them, those who are friends, right? But from the Islamic perspective, we don't have enough research, social research. We don't have original research. When some of our ulama, they go to the West, they become very prominent. But within the Western if you wish, system. I taught in Canada, I studied in Canada. That part of mine, I served Canada and its civilization and its EC and so forth. So research, and that will require a number of logistics. To education, we have to change our Islamic education systems into education that is holistic and comprehensive. We have to start to teach fiqh in the comprehensive sense, and therefore have at least multidisciplinary scholars. I get students who do PhD with me, and they are specialized in hadith, and they don't know anything about the Quran, and they are hadith scholars, or Quran and they don't know hadith, or history and they don't know fiqh, let alone science and technology and economics, at least basics to define these knowledges. They don't know, you see. And our education is very disciplinized, and disciplinary education is economics, is not knowledge. If we are going to build Islamic knowledge, we have to free the Islamic knowledge from the economics of it, and from feeding the market, nice employees who are faithful to the corporates. This is not the objective of education in Islam. I know it's a long way and a far shot, but we do have to start somewhere with research centers and then education centers. And number three, then action. And action has to be through organizations that are supported in order to change the system. And changing the system is not just a civil movement. Changing the system has to be through governments and through civil society and through mosques and through everything. Action is not just one thing. We think about action in terms of political action only, but political action is an outcome of the society. كما تكونون يولى عليكم, as you are, as your rulers will be. So if we develop our civilization in a way that represents our education, that is built on our research, then we are going to have rulers who represent us and governments that work for what we want, you see. But if we are corrupt and we are oppressive and we are unfair and violent people, our governments will be violent and oppressive, because where do they come from? They come from our kids who grow to become officials in any government, some good and some evil. So basically, the answer is a long story, but is to really reshape our thought and our education before we reshape our politics and wars and peace and these things. It's not time for that as a Muslim ummah. We're very weak people, and we really need to think and to stand on our feet before we do such things. Jazakallah khair.
So before giving the mic for another person, my field of study is political science. It's not really let's say fiqh, but now I understand that it's a fiqh, but in another shape or form.
But you have to go back to the Quran and Sunnah and start to rebuild and re-question your political theory, CD. Because in the heart of what you studied is political theory. Is there a political theory in Islam? Yes, of course, from the Quran and Sunnah.
So the question is, it's a yes or no question. So can this ijtihad be achieved without a political entity? You can achieve, let's say, a meta, let's say a multinational or something like that.
Well, politics at least has to allow it, at least, I mean, politics is not black and white, as you know. I mean, at least there has to be a political will to allow genuine research and to allow new research. Many of the institutions that we have in our Muslim countries and abroad as well are under governments, and supported by major governmental or official kind of state authorities. And they have to allow such an approach. Or you build, civil society think tanks that would think for you if you cannot think in the secular system.
Okay, so we're giving the mic to Sister Asma Sabri. Please go.
أهلا وسهلا.
السلام عليكم دكتور شرفتونا.
وعليكم السلام ورحمة الله.
Is my voice clear?
Yes, جزاك الله خير.
So there is actually I've been like talking with some friends about this since what's happening lately in Morocco with the normalization of relationships with the Israeli occupation. And what we've like some of the points we've discussed is that politics in general is under researched topic regarding ijtihad in general, and there are so many contemporary issues that are not like we don't have a clear stance on. Second thing is that also politics is also a kind of lenient topic in Islam, since it's part of what is it should go with what is good in general, with maslahah for people, etc. So here my question is, even some people consider politics to be like totally like non-governed by Sharia and stuff. So what is how much like and only of course governed by masalih and maqasid, etc. So how much maqasid are there in politics? And sometimes these maqasid are not like very clear. There are so many power dynamics between for example, we have, for example, like a paradigm. For example, I have like two very specific study cases. Like first, the boycott of France, for example. Some would say that okay, so because there was this blasphemy of the Prophet, peace be upon him. Some would say our stance, like a religious stance against it, is that we should do istinkar qalbi, for example, but we shouldn't go as far as doing the boycott because it has some other effects. For example, because so many companies, French companies, are invested in Morocco, and so it happened before that they may release Moroccan workers. And so some might lose their jobs, and so how to balance between these two. And second is that France is sorry, رأسمالية, it is a capitalistic power that is against the American capitalist power in some ways, and that by making it weak, we empower the American, for example, capitalist system, because they have like contradicting benefits from being in Africa, etc. This is one study case. The other study case is, like I said, the normalization of relationships with the Israeli occupation. And that some people say that we should understand the government decision to do that, and that this is just a step that they took in order to gain some momentum for other steps. But from my point of view, there is no guarantee for other steps, and so why am I even going to like concede in this? And yeah, there are so many like contradicting and sorry for making it very long question.
No, excellent. Exactly.
Professor, I'm sorry, do you prefer to go all of the questions and you answer them one by one, or should I read
one by one?
inshallah,
we can have a discussion. Yeah, inshallah, to address each as I
okay.
My sister, what you are talking about is at a level of details, at the level of political decisions or policies of government. What we need is to understand the bigger picture and to work for a more strategic level, not just the level of day-to-day decisions. The bigger picture, what is the bigger picture of politics in our time? You know, perhaps you call it geopolitical theories, but it's even beyond that. We need to go back to the very source of knowledge, the Quran and Sunnah Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and look for the basic definitions. And then from the basic definitions, we compare to what we have. We have a categorization of people in the Quran and Sunnah that is different from the way we categorize people. Like, give you one example. In the Quran and Sunnah, we are an ummah. The Muslimun, ummah, ummatun wahida. We are one ummah. And therefore, what happened during the time of the colonization and post-colonization is not Islamic, as simple as that. Yes, are you calling for like a khilafah? No, not necessarily, but I am just saying that as Muslims, we're not supposed to have borders that we fight each other for, let alone bring the enemies of Islam to define the borders for us. You see, we should take a step back and look at the whole strategy. We need a strategy. How to deal with the occupation in Palestine requires a strategy. Not every individual person in power or not in power, just working for their own sake and for their tomorrow. Maybe the day after tomorrow, we will see what will happen. This kind of strategy. There's no strategy. People are not strategizing. People are just making decisions to remain in power for the next day. And people in government to remain, to get their paycheck in the next month. It's really, we're boiled down to this. So I don't have the capacity to address how the Muslim majority countries, if you wish, how can they deal with France and the clownish stuff that is happening in the politics there and the defamation of the Prophet ﷺ by a secular government in France. But France is not the secular government and the cartoons. France is the occupation of Africa and the killing of the ulama of Islam and the changing of the language. France has a much deeper history in the aggression. And we should be concerned about the linguistic aggression more than the aggression of a silly cartoon and the invasion of ideas and the invasion of economy. France doesn't have natural resources. Natural resources are from Africa, stolen from there. Similarly, the other colonizers, we have to be concerned about these things because these things are more aggression than a silly cartoon. It's not the first time that the Prophet ﷺ was defamed. They called him sahir wa sha'ir wa kahin. They called him everything. The Quran is telling us. And, فأعرض عنهم وقل لهم في أنفسهم قولا بليغا. Give them a penetrating advice, ask them. We can object, we can boycott, that is fine, depending on societies where you are. Obviously, if you're in France, you're not going to boycott yourself or something like, I don't know.
Yeah.
But this is the smaller part of the picture. I am just saying that in the time allowed for us here, which is a limited time, I'm directing you, my sister and my brothers and sisters, to look at the bigger picture, the post-colonial picture as a whole, and where we are, and to do research on how this picture can change, because so far it is not sustainable. Even if some governments survive by making some concessions, if they are sincere, they have to look at the bigger picture and the wider pattern. And the siyasa in Islam is not just about the hukm, by the way. It's not just about the government, the hukuma. A siyasa in Islam is the people, and everybody is part of a siyasa. And I know you're going to take what I'm saying and project it to some Western theory or the other. I'm not talking about Western theories. I'm talking about Islam. And I'm not talking about siyasa shar'iyya, ala, Mawardi and so forth, people who wrote their books as gifts for some prince or the other. This is not really siyasa shar'iyya that is in Islam, and they debate whether the emir has to be from Quraysh or hadith Muawiyah al-Bukhari. No, this is politics. I'm talking about the siyasa as in power. What is siyasa? It is power, authority, sultan. The sultan is not in one person. Sultan is for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's to start with. And then the sultan in Islam is not just one person. And wali al-amr is not just one person. Everybody is a wali al-amr. And in Islam, the Islamic civilization survived regardless of the corruption of some governments, because the Ummah was fine. The Ummah was not corrupt. The Ummah was doing business and doing culture and doing language and trade and building roads and doing awqaf. The Ummah was good, even though some of the princes were really corrupt and some of them were not even Muslim, right? But we are, as an Ummah, we hold the power. And if the Ummah doesn't have the power, the government is powerless. In Canada here, we joke about it sometimes. We don't imagine a defense minister in Canada making a coup and taking government. It's unimaginable. Why? Because we, the people, are going to go and wring his neck. We are not going to allow that. Everybody, every one of those 40 million Canadians is going to go to Ottawa and wring his neck if he takes power. And that is how we are a democratic country, despite the fact that in Islam is not compatible with democracy in some aspects, but in some aspects it is. So just a quick answer.
No, thank you very much. Now I have two questions having the same point. The first is by Sister Marwa Tufaha. You speaking about the lecture, you did not just touch the subject, you flipped our minds. That's good. So we need a reference, please. The second is by Adam Spoor. He's saying, I'm listening while smiling, very happy with that, with this speech. SubhanAllah, over the past few weeks, and I was still going. I was arguing with some experts about philosophy of psychology and psychiatry, and the impossibility of merging the Islamic school of Tazkiyah with the Western view of mental health. I think he's a psychiatrist, Dr. School, except with corrupting the basis of one. My question is there any recommended resources to help us with the argument? I mean, in English, because our people like this English resources stuff. So, two questions about resources.
Allah Akram. For both of you, if you want resources about what I told you, these humble ideas, I'm writing a book. I'm actually now giving it to the publisher today or tomorrow. Inshallah, it should appear in a couple months. By the title so far of Re-envisioning Islamic Scholarship. And the subtitle or the basic title would be Maqasid Methodology. So I'm writing a book on methodology on how to approach Islamic scholarship in that fiqh sense that I mentioned. What I gave you in the lecture is actually an introduction of the book, of that book. And that book is an outcome of research that we do in the Maqasid Institute. My brother mentioned that I'm honored to be the president of that think tank, maqasid.org, MAQASID.org. And maqasid.org has a place where you can join a research group. We're still building that. It's a new center now, 5 years old. We're still building our research network of scholars in order to re-envision the Islamic scholarship this way. And we have a graduate program now in South Africa that we are trying to graduate students from who research that. So maqasid.org, jasseraude.net, my writings, even though I haven't published that book yet. But if you wish, I can, once I have notes, at least from the book, I can send, inshallah, to my brother, and then perhaps he can email to you, at least the lecture notes. I could send that. Regarding the philosophy of psychology, the impossibility of merging or the Islama or the Islamization, I agree with you. I think I'm not talking about the Islamization of Knowledge project, because the Islamization of Knowledge project is both. Some were trying to integrate knowledge and bringing knowledge from the sources up, and some were doing contradiction in like epistemological contradiction. So I'm not talking about the project as in the International Institute of Islamic Thought. It's IIIT is many things. It's not just one school, or it's a number of streams, the different talk. But in terms of the Islamization this way, this is contradiction in the source of knowledge. And when you have a contradiction in the source of knowledge, and therefore you study Islam from the books of fiqh, which, as I mentioned, are books of history, more than the Quran and Sunnah. And you study politics or psychology or anthropology from the latest American textbook, then you have a contradiction in your source of knowledge. And you have what I call in that new book, epistemological schizophrenia. And the epistemological schizophrenia is going to lead to a moral schizophrenia. You are going to have a double life, as we see in a number of epistemological schizophrenics there, where you have two different references, Islam and Kufr, really. Freudians or Darwinians in terms of creation, this is Kufr, you see. So Islam and Kufr cannot really coexist in a methodology. And when you have both, then you are going to have a moral outcome that is contradictory. What is the solution? Is to go back to the original source of knowledge, which is the Quran and Sunnah. Study history as much as you want because it's useful, but you go to the Quran and Sunnah and build a framework. And that book of mine explains ideas about that. And there is a series that's inshallah coming from scholars who work on this methodology to really try to re-envision scholarship from the basic questions of the knowledge up, the basic questions of psychology up. What is the human and how does the human act and feel? What are the components? What is consciousness? And these kinds of questions that you have answers in the current secular academia that are contrary to Islam for. And therefore, we have to really rebuild from the basic questions up. And from that, we create research, as I mentioned, and from research, we start to have a critical mass of production that will form education. And from education, then we can have action. And therefore, we can counsel people properly. But if we counsel people with a contradiction of sources of knowledge, so sometimes we treat that person who is sick in front of me, I'm counseling him or her, I treat her in a Freudian way, or I treat her in an Islamic way. And sometimes we mess people by contradiction in our sources of knowledge. So that's my answer.
Okay, so Sister Rand is saying, is fiqh connected to every, as if fiqh is connected to every field, should we study it with whatever field we are interested in order to know the Islamic ethics values regarding to that field? Is this realistic to common people?
My answer is, it is not realistic and it's not right, not because of the common versus distinct. It's not about smartness here. It's about the division of disciplines. When you asked my sister about, should we study fiqh as the ethics of the field? How do you define your field? Fields of knowledge are defined today based on employment. And this is not how fields of knowledge should be defined in Islam. You study medicine to become a doctor, and you study IT to become the programming guy. And you study history to become a historian or a writer in a particular thing. Knowledge in Islam is not about employment primarily. Knowledge in Islam is about the ideas and about a well-rounded approach. The Quran doesn't deal with phenomena in a disciplinary way. It deals with phenomena in a very complex way. And we should perhaps move from disciplinarity to multidisciplinarity, which is a trend anyway in people who invented disciplinarity in the modern sense. And then I would add, from multidisciplinarity, we move to transdisciplinarity, to create a student and a scholar and a textbook and a university and a culture that does not go by disciplines, even though you could be, you could have a skill, you could be a good surgeon, but you cannot be a good surgeon and you don't know how to eat, and you don't know your history, and you don't know geography, you don't know where Turkey is in the world, for example, you don't know where India is. And we see surgeons who know nothing but his particular surgery that he does. And this is not a lack of time, this is a lack of education. And therefore, what I am saying is that the fiqh, yes, has to deal with disciplines, but this is a stage. This is one level of trying to bring Islam back to life. But within the disciplines, we have to reconstruct, and reconstruct requires deconstruction. And deconstruction has to do with knowledge and power. You guys, I'm speaking English here. If we are talking Islamic, deconstruction will have to do with the usul al-ilm, and how the usul are compatible with our usul. And then you deconstruct and you critique, if you wish, al-ilm, and then you reconstruct it, and then you go beyond the discipline to multidisciplinarity, and then transdisciplinarity, phenomena study. And the phenomena study is going to take you to the reality of life. How do you define phenomena, and how you approach phenomena based on the objectives, on the purposes. And here Islam comes in order to restructure in that sense. So this is, my answer. Allah.
Yeah. So the last question tonight, and sorry if we bothered you.
No.
In current life, he's saying, Brother Ghaith is saying, in current life, being an expert, let's say in tech, will take most of our time. And at the same time, today's scholars are far away from even understanding how things are working. For example, I have asked many sheikhs about many things in tech, and Islam, and Islam answered to the new Islam answers to the new models of paying, using, sharing intellectual material, and the answers vary from forbidding to short answers that far away from practical. From our understanding to our Islamic maqasid, not to look at the easiest answer. What should we do in this sense?
Wallahi, your question has two parts. One has to do with we don't have time to study many disciplines and to become encyclopedic and all of that. And this is not a question of skill or knowledge. This is a question of economics, because you are made to spend your life to study, let's say, car design or windshields or just this part of the motor. This is for economic reasons. You could have done much better with your life if the education system was built in a more comprehensive way to build a better person, a more educated person. Okay, so who is going to make this windshield perfect? Who cares about the windshield? Who cares about growth? Islam is not about growth in economics. Islam is about well-being. And when we insist that the objective of economics is growth, we are going against the Islamic values, because growth means to sacrifice the quality of life of the people and the knowledge of the people and the well-roundedness, and to make the person a slave to the company that does what he or she spent their life learning, right? So I'm talking about a different system, and I'm not unaware of the practicalities, but the practicalities I'm advising my brother are tied to the economics, and the economics are not necessarily correct. They are full of philosophy and value and full of leadership of a society in a certain direction. And we are not supposed to be directed away from the Islamic values and the Islamic purposes. You mentioned that you asked sheikhs about intellectual property or designing cars. How can a sheikh understand that? But that's, again, back to the education. I studied law and jurisprudence and so forth. I spent most of my academic studies in this. I studied a couple other science disciplines, but I haven't studied policy or governance. I don't know intellectual property. And I know enough not to tell you that intellectual property is hifdhul mal, the preservation of wealth. No, it isn't. Intellectual property is a tool of government to maintain the monopoly of some ideas to some companies, usually international companies. If you apply the intellectual property to today's debates over the vaccines and so on, you will see that the companies don't even want to give their licenses to governments to produce the vaccine. Well, they made governments incapable of producing vaccines anyway. They don't have the capability because they cut their wings in the pharmaceutical industry. I know that not as an expert, as a general reader and somebody who observes and reads and so on. But you can really not go and ask a sheikh who specializes in a particular book of fiqh or hadith, not even the rest of the books of the hadith, just one makhtuta that he studied all his life. And you want to go to him and ask about intellectual property and government policy. He doesn't understand that. And he will give you a wrong fatwa, with all due respect, because he doesn't understand the economics of it, and he doesn't comprehend how the intellectual property is a weapon, where people die in Africa over a medicine for $1 or $2, even though all the gold comes from Africa anyway. People die there because of $1 or $2 medicine, because of intellectual property. People have monopoly over our information. And as we speak, every interested government is going to have a copy of this lecture or whatever, because of intellectual property, and because this is how it is. And we need to be aware of what's going on, and not really burden our sheikhs and our ustad with things that they did not learn. If you want to learn something, you go and become a specialized in it. One of our ustads, or one of my favorite ustads, Sheikh Yusuf al-Qaradawi, Allah yahfadhu wa yukrimu, he told me that when he started to talk about Islamic finance, he realized that he doesn't understand finance in his youth. So he told me he went to Cairo University and did a degree in financing in order to understand financing. Because as a sheikh coming from the Usul al-Din faculty in Al-Azhar, he doesn't understand anything about financing. But when he took a degree, at least, even though a secular degree in Cairo University, but at least a degree, some sort of a degree. And then he started to be an imam in Islamic financing and Islamic economics in some of his writings. Why? Because he studied that. I'm not asking, for you to go and study, particular, because eventually the sheikh in his, my recent conversations with him, he believes in a multidisciplinary scholar. He believes in a scholar who studies several sciences so that he becomes mutakhassis. So what I'm saying is that the imams of Islam who contributed to economics or siyasa or chemistry or any of that, they went and studied that properly in order for them to be able to contribute. But if the imam of Islam only studied some books of fiqh from the past, they really cannot give you any informed fatwa in medicine or policy or arts. They don't understand these things. And therefore you have to ask them to study what they talk about before they talk about. Jazakallah khair.
Professor, I really can't thank you enough for this horizon widening lecture. And now myself and the students of Islamic Studies 103 and the Institute of Islamic Thought in Ankara, I would like to thank you very much for your time and for your words. And I hope that we will be meeting soon, inshallah, in Ankara or in Canada.
And more than happy, this will eventually come to myself. So please use that. And inshallah, happy to communicate and answer questions.
Thank you very much. Students, now